Hey, blessings.
Hi. It's a fine meal.
Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
So you were in another land, were
Yeah,
you?
I was in the motherland learning about seeing and comparing notes on restorative justice. And to see it in action in the village context was really, really good.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really good.
Hey, Donna, welcome back. I'm glad you're home safe. Can't wait to hear all about the trip.
Yeah, the bad news is y'all thought I was a pain around restorative justice before. This is like I don't know what to call it. It was a pilgrimage to the land of restorative justice at the village level.
Which areas?
We were in Lagos. Well, we were in Lagos State, so we were in and around Lagos. We did one or two things on Lagos Island, but yeah, in and around Lagos.
We'll have to bring you to our next meeting. Wait, tomorrow and Thursday, we have a meeting in New York with the National Council of Churches and National Council of Synagogues, and we're studying restorative justice and reparations.
Ooh.
And the hope is we're trying to learn from real world models. So we've had some webinars with folks in Providence, in Evanston, and we're going to learn about the German model a little bit as a deep dive tomorrow and Thursday. And then, the hope is to really dive in and learn from the South African and the Irish experience in terms of, truth and reconciliation.
Well, don't leave Nigeria out.
We won't. So we'll be in touch. Anyway, we should probably talk about what we're doing. What are we doing?
Hi there, Molly. Welcome. We're just getting our feet underneath us. Give us a few moments. So what we'll do, we'll give a few moments for folks to kind of trickle in. I'll do a general introduction of the series that we've been running this semester. I will introduce our two panelists, our two guests, and then we'll hop to questions. Reverend Jones, Rabbi Strauss, do you have any questions for me before we get started?
Well, just the one that we talked about. I mean, I assume when we're talking about the role of religion in the public square, mostly going to focus on the role of, churches, pastors, rabbis speaking about social justice issues and the risks and all of that.
Right.
Less about should there be a creche in front of City Hall.
Yes, unless that's something that you want to talk about, and if the conversation goes there, then it goes there.
I mean, you can go there. It's just that, as I shared with you, I think you really need lawyers know much more about that. I mean, I can give a little bit of a view on that, but lawyers really know much more. As I said to somebody today, I know enough to do a lunch and learn with the rabbi about it, but not enough to dissect the law cases in front of the courts.
Sure. And that's my reminder that my folder with my notes for that part of our conversation over here.
Need my son for that. He works for the firm that represented Dominion, who just won against Fox News.
Yes, I just saw that.
Congratulations, Papa.
Yeah, I should text him. I better get a nice Father's Day present now.
Oh my.
Donna, remind me, after Trump was elected, we did a convocation at then was called Germantown Theological Seminary about how you claim a pastoral and prophetic voice. Were you at that or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, all, it's just 5 o'clock. We're going to give a few more moments to allow folks to trickle in and do battle with Zoom. And then we'll begin our session together.
If anyone cares to take a look at their chat in the meantime, just shared, let us know where you're zooming in from. Okay. One of the beautiful things about Zoom.
Edward, what do you think? Should we go ahead and get started?
I think it's good to do. Yes.
Okay. Listen, thank you all for joining us this evening. Before I introduce our two guests, I'd like to take a few moments to share context for this event. In this series, current and former theological students from multiple religious backgrounds are invited to share their experiences, engage their curiosity, and learn with and from one another. So for this year, for the 2023 Inter-Seminary Initiative Student Series, this was a theme that came out of a survey that we conducted with students at, I think, about 9 different institutions. And so the theme for this year will be, what is the role of religion in the public square? To that end, you will hear from faith leaders experienced in combining faith and public involvement, and talk about how to answer this question within the context of one's own tradition and in relationship to one another. So now to introduce our two guests. I'll start with Reverend Dr. Donna Lawrence Jones, currently serves as founding pastor of the Cookman Beloved Community Baptist Church. Prior to 2011, she served for 18 years as the senior pastor of Cookman United Methodist Church. Both congregations have been very active locally, nationally, and internationally in the areas of prophetic witness, education, and restorative justice. I know we'll be hearing more about that this evening. Reverend Jones has been a public policy advocate in Harrisburg and in Washington, D.C. on issues related to economic justice, education, and restorative practices for juveniles touched by the criminal system. Reverend Jones currently serves on the ministerial staff of the White Rock Baptist Church, is chair of the Philadelphia Faith-Based Reentry Coalition, and is a member of the Black Clergy of Philadelphia and vicinity. Rabbi David Strauss is the senior rabbi emeritus of Mainline Reform Temple in Wynwood, Pennsylvania. He served as senior rabbi of Mainline Reform Temple for 24 years and retired in July. It says July of 2023, but that has yet to happen. So we'll see more.
2022.
2022, there we go. Rabbi Strauss remains active in the Jewish and non-Jewish community. He's a past president of the VAAD, the Philadelphia Board of Rabbis, and served as the chair of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Community Relations Council from 2010 to 2014. He's a co-convener of the Religious Leaders Council of Greater Philadelphia and serves on the board and executive committee of Interfaith Philadelphia and the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joe's University. He's the chair of the National Council of Synagogues. Welcome to both of our panelists for this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I suppose to start the conversations, it's always good to know that we're talking about the same thing. And for those of you who hopped on the call a little bit earlier, you heard us trying to parse out some of this. The term the public square carries a lot of weight. Some folks, particularly those in the legal square, will say the public square refers to all settings outside private homes and houses of worship. I suppose my first question to start for Reverend Jones and for Rabbi Strauss is, what do you consider to be the public square, and what definition should we use while we're chatting this evening? This is the challenge with Zoom. We can't like make eye contact and figure out who's first.
Well, to me, I just kind of go back to fourth grade American history with that whole, when they put the crate out in the public square and people would stand and say, abolition now or whatever, it was just standing for justice, trying to move people's hearts and minds in the direction of whoever happens to be standing there. So it was a very free space. People could speak, and usually they were speaking about issues related to public life, government. Well, I think everything is government personally. So those things that impact the public, people would have their voice in the public square. So it's a place of voice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think I'd build on what the definition you shared with us, Regina. I think within the Jewish community, the public sphere or square is really understood in two ways. One is the role of religion in public space as a physical or spiritual presence. And Jews have typically been on the side of wanting to see a pretty strong separation between church and state in terms of worship or the use of religious symbols or things like that within the public square area. But in its broader context, and that's really the area I prefer to spend most of our time this evening, is really, what is the role of religion in addressing issues, both social issues, moral issues, political issues, contemporary issues, and what's going on in Washington and in Harrisburg.
Okay, thank you both. So yeah, if we use that idea of what is the role of religion and faith leaders in addressing those issues and serving as public witness, how does your faith call you to action? This time we'll start with you, Rabbi Strauss.
So I come from a tradition that calls itself the heirs to the prophetic tradition. That's, I think, a little arrogant. I'm not sure that I am prophetic or my religious tradition is prophetic. But I asked Donna earlier on, right after Trump was elected president, we convened about 200 religious leaders from the Philadelphia area. We met at Germantown Seminary, talking about how do we be both prophetic and a little arrogant and pastoral at this incredibly difficult time for many of us. And I remember what I think Rabbi Rick Jacob, who was the president of the URJ, my movement, had to say, which is, if you take the passages in the Hebrew Bible, and I think you could say the New Testament as well, and I'm guessing the Quran, although I'm less familiar with that, although I think the people here are all out of Christian traditions, so that, from what I can tell from the chat. If you take the passages out of our scriptures that deal with the poor, the widow, and orphan, meaning the most vulnerable people in their society, I think, if we were to update that today, it would be the homeless, the migrant, the refugee, the poor, the widow, the orphan. You can add to the list. If you take those passages out, there ain't a whole lot left to read, which is, I think, a way of saying, if religion is only going to be about bringing you some kind of spiritual comfort and doesn't address the real world in which we live, and I think ultimately make most of us feel a bit uncomfortable. The stereotype has been said, right? The role of religion is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. If you take that stuff out, I don't think that's what faith or religion or spirituality are about. I think, and this is a little strong, so I apologize for it, but I think if it's only about us, it's actually an ultimate form of narcissism.
Thank you, Rabbi Strauss. Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I would agree with Rabbi Strauss on all of those. Since I'm looking at folk who tend to follow the Christian tradition, I do believe that in our tradition it's impossible to be anything less than light and love in the community. And I think when we look at all the religions from, the Abrahamic faiths to the other faiths, we see a consistency in God desiring us to be loving, to be our best selves. So I think it is critical, really, for us all to be engaged in speaking truth to power, be engaged in prophetic witness around justice. And the Christian community, when Jesus said, if you only knew the things that make for peace. And I think we are called to proclaim the things that make for peace and to stand up against the things that don't. And that has to happen in public. So it's part of our call.
So we have in Jewish tradition, I mean, one of the ways I guess we differ is who the Messiah is and the role of the Messiah. But putting all of that aside, that's really not important for our conversation today. There's this debate within Judaism about when is the Messiah going to come and what is the role of the Messiah. And the Messianic age, in some sense, is viewed as, that time when our broken world, gets closer to that moment of redemption when there is peace and justice and equality and all of the rest for all. Kafka had this wonderful book of parables, and which he writes, the Messiah will come one day after he's no longer needed, which is, I think, in my Reformed tradition, and it speaks very powerfully to me, that we are in a profound way co-partners with God and are called by God to help repair and mend the broken world in which we live in. And so that question of how one does that is critical, but how you can do that without being in the public square, I think it's really impossible.
Thank you. So the target audience for this evening is students who are currently going through their theological studies and those professors, teachers who are accompanying them during this time. So given that these by and large are folks who are just beginning their process in ministry, in undertaking this type of work, can you share a bit about how you first got involved in bridging, things from your own faith tradition and then stepping further into the public?
I think my case is I came from a congregation, White Rock Baptist Church, that was very involved in the civil rights movement. And my family came to White Rock when I was 3. So the only way I had to understand our responsibility as people of faith was that place of speaking truth to power, public witness, our responsibility to be about the business of ensuring that everybody had enough and nobody had too little. So it was never, I was blessed. I can't remember a time that I didn't understand our responsibility to speak around those who are lifting up their voice around issues that impact everybody. I know that's kind of a convoluted sentence, but my short answer is I've never not. I was raised in a church that taught that this was our responsibility and lived into it. So there were only 6 churches in Philly, Black churches, that were part of March on Washington or would allow Martin King to speak in a pulpit. White Rock was one of them. We had King, we had Jesse Jackson, we had he had everybody. So as far as I was concerned, that's the way you're supposed to be. So I didn't know any other way.
Yeah, I would actually echo what Donna had to say. My parents are both German refugees. I joked with my wife that until I met her, I didn't know anybody had parents or grandparents that didn't have accents. And that experience shaped them. And they belonged to, I grew up in a congregation in Poughkeepsie, New York, that was served by a German refugee rabbi who spoke about Dr. King and civil rights and the war in Vietnam and the need for justice every Friday night at every service that we went to. It was just, I think it was part of my mother's milk. One of my earliest memories is actually going to an interfaith vigil and then learning and then action after Dr. King was assassinated. I mean, it's just always been a part of my life.
Thank you. And Rabbi Strauss, I had a similar background to you in terms of many accented grandparents in my life growing up. So I suppose what I'd like to give you the opportunity to do at this point is to talk a bit about, I read your biographies, and those I know to be just tiny little snapshots. And they barely even touched on the work that you all have done. But if you'd like to take some time and talk about, what types of issues you've become involved with, where you find the most meaning, where you have found the most challenge, and speak a little bit about your experiences there.
Well, I guess I can talk now. I mean, one of the things I probably should have added to my CV, especially for this, I'm currently co-chairing a group called RAC-PA. RAC is the Religious Action Center. It's really our movement's lobby in Washington, D.C., or perhaps better than lobby, the place where we try to action social justice policy. What the history of the RAC likes to tell is that it was actually in their conference room that the civil rights legislation of 1966 was drafted. So it's really been an important part of our movement. And what RAC-PA is about is trying to, on a statewide basis, advocate for the kinds of things that we're trying to advocate for in Washington, D.C. So, the issues are not terribly surprising. Issues of gun violence and gun safety right now, of healthcare, of education funding, which I believe is the justice issue, perhaps, in the state of Pennsylvania right now, of voting rights, that there's not voter intimidation, that it's easy to vote, that all votes are cast, that every voice, every vote is heard and is counted, issues of the environment. Those are some of the issues that we're trying to work on now on a statewide basis. We're actually just in the process of a transition, which is that we had been working on issues of civic engagement, namely voting, and we're now trying to decide what the major focus of our next campaign is going to be. And again, it's probably either going to be guns and gun safety, education, or environmental issues.
Yeah, I think for me, the one thing that wasn't on the bio is I'm executive director of the Metropolitan Christian Council. And that's 100-year, will be 100 in 2 years, 2025. And it was started as a rather traditional council of churches. Now it's a Black-led philanthropy. So we do some grant making, and we also really focus on restorative justice and everything that we do. And if I look at my whole career and all the different things that are written down, they do pretty much convene at restorative justice. Justice to me is about fairness. And I think as far as issues go, at the top of the list is ending mass incarceration and seeing how every other area anyone works on leads to ending that. So not only those things that are related directly with the criminal system, but when we look at statistics around education and education reform, especially in low wealth communities, when we look at issues related to healthcare and mental health care, and we look at the numbers in who are incarcerated, whose issues really are related to education and healthcare, you get rid of about a whole lot of people, overwhelming majority of people who are incarcerated. You look at issues related to environment and environmental justice and how they impact, we've got asbestos in our schools. We have all kinds of after effects of controlled substances in the bodies of people. You put all of that together, and it just feeds and feeds and feeds into the carceral system. And we can stand and say it needs to come down all we want, but unless those issues are wrestled with, at least in honest ways, there will always be mass incarceration. And in many communities, especially with the African American, American Indian community, who are the most incarcerated people, period, on the planet, and you trace it back, it goes to low wealth, it goes to environmental justice, it goes to substances, it goes to a lot of things. So they say begin with the end in mind. So the end is ending the carceral system as we know it, period. And to get there, also recognizing that there's a lot of structural work that has to be done to ensure fairness in education, in health, physical and mental, in environment, in so many ways that we have failed to wrestle with and deal with.
Yeah, I would just add one. I agree with everything that Donna just said. That one thing, that maybe doesn't need to be said, but maybe does, is the work that we do is always in partnership and in coalition with others. We in the Jewish community are just too small to be able to do it on our own. It's a driving, activating force behind the work that we do, but we seek to do this in partnership. And in terms of the work of RACPA, most especially in partnership with communities, BIPOC communities that are majorly affected by this, in communities that are led by BIPOC folks, and that the work that we do makes a difference in those communities as well.
Ditto.
Thank you both. So you've spoken, both of you. I was taking notes and then I ran out of room on the Post-it where I started taking notes about the number of issues that you talked about, the number of ways in which you touch these things and you bring witness. So can you talk about what the value of public witness is for, Dr. Jones, you spoke about mass incarceration. Can you talk about the role of ministerial workers acting as public witness on that topic?
I think sometimes it's interesting to talk about something with the exact opposite. And so I'm thinking about the movement of the extreme religious right currently, and using their understanding, or their, in my opinion, misunderstanding. So if anybody here is extraordinarily conservative Christian, you might want to turn this down about now. But there's a way of doing public square that's harmful with the public, with people. And now I forgot the question.
But it's what's the value in public witness?
Oh, okay. So the value in public witness, one of those values is to address evil, and not evil from the standpoint of morals. Not the way we've come to understand morals, that we've kind of compartmentalized morals to what you do in the bedroom, or what you, just human stupidity kind of stuff that we all participate in. I think that to be able to speak in larger ways around the underlying issues that find their home in love. If we love one another, one of the things that I'm female clergy, came to seminary at Lutheran, hi Molly, back in the 80s, when there weren't a lot of places for women called to pastoral ministry. And I look at those times and I see how once excluded, more and more women are included. That didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened in a public square, where girls like me saw people, where girls like me heard other interpretations of scripture. So it's important just for expanding people's understanding. If all I watch is Fox News or CNN, it's not good. There's got to be that public space where I can find all kinds of opinions and all kinds of attitudes about what's right and what's wrong, what's godly, what's not, what's love, what's not. And then to trust that if that is happening in every aspect of my life, eventually I'll figure something out that leans toward love. That makes sense.
So I'd like to go back to where Donna began. What is the value of public witness? One is that we live in a country right now where much of the religious voice has been dominated by the religious right. And I think there's an obligation for those of us who are the religious center or the religious left to say that that's not the only authentic religious voice. In fact, to be honest, I think that voice is an inauthentic religious voice in most cases. A second place, I think, to begin about why this is important or the power of that is, I think if you look at history, every social movement for change in America has begun in the basements of churches and synagogues and mosques, whether it's the movement for independence, the movement for abolition, the movement for a woman's right to vote, the movements for racial justice and racial equality, the movements for the right for everyone to be able to have fair access to the ballot box. Those all began in the basements of churches and synagogues and mosques, and without our voices, those movements can't succeed. Now, my son brought up an interesting question, which I think is a real challenge for some, perhaps, which is, well, one of the big movements today in America is the movement for the right to choose and to love whom you want to love and to marry who you want to marry, and the list goes on there. I come from a religious tradition for whom these are non-issues. I don't know that that's going to be the same for all liberal religions. Unfortunately, the bedroom has become a very divisive issue, even in liberal congregations. I'm kind of surprised in the liberal Jewish community, when the issue of the ordination of women first came up, everybody was predicting it would, who knows what was going to come from heaven, and it turned out to be a yawn. Nobody cared. It wasn't divisive at all, and so we're part of that tradition that is supporting all of these movements. The third that I would say is, I think the power that we have as religious folks, we don't have economic power. We don't really have political power. We have moral power. And we also have the power, I'm trying to think of what's the right word, symbolic power. But symbolic and moral power are not meaningless if we choose to use them. I think we've been afraid to use them, especially in the public sphere, often enough. But I think we need to reclaim both our moral and our symbolic power, because they are real. Mm-hmm. And they galvanize people and they speak to people's hearts. And that's what's really important.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to pick up off something that you said, Rabbi Strauss, just a moment ago, where you talked about, there's some issues which are highly divisive at this point. And I think that where there used to be a lot of alignment within people and traditions, perhaps theologically, we're now seeing some of those divides happening politically within those same congregations. Do you ever face pushback from within your own tradition or the work that you undertake?
If you're not getting pushback, you're not doing your work. But I'm also aware, and this is a very difficult time. And when I speak to younger colleagues, especially in the Jewish community, this post-COVID world is an overwhelming time for trying to figure out how to lead and pastor a congregation. So you didn't ask for some guidance, but I'll give students, if you remember nothing else that I had to say, I think there are two things congregants never forget. And Edward's heard me say this before. So the two things they never forget is that you came to visit them in the hospital and that you didn't. And if you can build deep relations, especially pastoral relations first, with members of your community, if they know that you're going to be there with them and hold their hand and pray with them and walk with them and comfort them in those difficult moments that come to every human life. First off, they'll forgive a crappy sermon. They will forgive and not forget that you didn't prepare for the class that you were supposed to teach. They'll even disagree with what you have to say from the pulpit. But because you were there for them, they will love you in a way that they'll never forget. You know, I can tell you in my rabbinate, and I'm sure there's software in the Christian world that does the same thing. It was wonderful. I would get an email, you know, a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and a year after a member of my congregation had lost a loved one. And 99% of the calls that I made were to answering machines. You know, there was nobody there to pick up the phone. But when I would see somebody, they would approach with tears. You didn't forget me. You were there. You cared. You knew that I was not, it made me feel that I was not alone. And, you know, I think if you can build those relationships, it gives you an awful lot of political capital to be able to take risks. But it's hard right now. This is a very divisive world. And I'm learning from younger colleagues that it takes a lot of courage to be able to address issues from the pulpit because they're afraid that they will alienate either their more liberal or their more conservative members. But I think that's what we're called to do as leaders. I think you need to strike up the courage to be able to do that. Now, the one thing in the Jewish community, I think it's probably different than, as I understand, especially in the African American community, but maybe in the Catholic community as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with being political. I don't think being political is a dirty word. We try to not be partisan. So the Jewish community, by and large, is not going to endorse candidates. That's not the same, I know, in other faith communities where they will endorse candidates. You know, theoretically, the law is pretty clear. You're not allowed, if you're a 501c3, to be partisan. You're not supposed to be doing that, but the truth is nobody has ever been prosecuted for doing it.
Yeah, one thing, and it is rare. I have known Rabbi Strauss usually in activism and public square work for quite some time, Bible studies, you name it. He's the first rabbi I ever really got to be around. And for a long time, he was the only rabbi. So that's changing, thanks to Rabbi Strauss, actually. But so I want you to know that on this date, April 18th, 2023, I'm going to disagree with something Rabbi Strauss said.
Good.
And that is that we don't have wealth. 71% of our nation's folk are religious people. 71%. Over 55% of our nation's people and the majority of that 55% are Judeo-Christian, are wealthy. So if you look at that number of people, then the religious community actually has, and especially if you look at that 10% line item where our wealth lies, we'll find that we actually have a lot of wealth. We have wealth as religious people. Those of us of the Abrahamic traditions have wealth. We have wealth and we have power. More than 80% of our elected officials are people that practice their religion. So wealth we've got, power we've got, love,
To shift our focus just a little bit, and you've both touched on this a bit in your responses to this point, but I'd like to have a moment to perhaps speak a bit more explicitly about how you develop partnerships across faith lines. You know, how do you interact with folks who come from different traditions but who are working on the same topics, and how do you utilize the difference? How do you utilize the different perspectives and all of the I just keep using the word different over and over again. But so how do you engage with one another and allowing the difference to not divide you, but to unify you and to enrich your efforts?
I think I've just been blessed. I was raised in a church that was both ecumenical and interfaith at a time where many churches weren't either. So again, those congregations that were part of the movement tended to, I think, be both ecumenical and interfaith. The civil rights movement, that is, because the movement was both ecumenical and interfaith. So it's one of those things that I don't remember not being. But if I think about things that I learned in Sunday school or that I learned in church about how to be with others, I was also raised up in a church that did not have a big ethic around proselytizing. So us being in the company of others wasn't to convince others to be Christian. It was to work together on common agendas and recognizing kind of a very Quaker way, that of God and everybody. But there was a sense that my understanding, and this came from teachings growing up, my understanding, our understanding is going to be different depending on where people are from, but not from the standpoint of where we are the one who knows. So that's another one that is just in my water. So I'm just grateful that my coming of faith was in such a place.
So I would agree with everything that Donna has said and add to it that it's really hard work. Both Donna, Edward, and I are involved with a group of Black pastors and rabbis who try to meet once a month to study Bible, but really to build deep relationships with one another. We're calling it Rebuilding Beloved Community, in the words of Dr. King. And we looked back on the civil rights movement in the 60s as this messianic or wonderful time where everybody sat together at the table, where everybody played in the sandbox and loved each other. The truth is, interreligious, yet alone, interracial politics are really complicated and really difficult. In the 60s, there were lots of people who were very angry that other people were sitting next to them at the table and didn't want them there. So it's hard work, but I think if you can take, in a sense, the tagline of Interfaith Philadelphia, dare to understand, as a place to be able to begin. If you begin with a place of curiosity, of a certain humility, knowing that you can't do this work alone. And by the way, the person sitting next to you may just know something that you don't, or more than you do. And the other place that I come, and Edward's heard me say this before as well, I actually hate the bumper sticker that, has the symbols of religious tradition and says tolerance. Tolerance is it's not a terribly high standard. It's kind of the minimum we ought to expect for each other as people of privilege. It doesn't take a whole lot to be tolerant. I want to live in a world where diversity is actually a cherished value, where I really believe that spending time with people who look different than I do, who believe differently than I do, who maybe even live and act differently than I do, is not something that's threatening, but actually genuinely enhances my life, and especially my spiritual and religious life.
Yeah, I would agree also with that, and made me think, Rabbi, about it takes vigilance until it becomes habit.
Yeah.
And that's another place of the public square, though. So I'm always pushing back against interfaith stuff, because interfaith has come to mean hide your faith from everybody, and I've had a chance to do some travel in other countries that are more pluralistic, where there are more, usually in the context that I work, usually they're Christian and Muslim. And when I'm in those countries that truly get along well together, the Muslim does not feel bad about making a prayer using the terminology because it's not offensive, and neither are the Christians. So I went to recently I was out of the country, and I went to, we were invited to church as a delegation that was Baptist. And in our delegation were Christians and Muslims. And when we went to the church on Easter Sunday morning, the pastor didn't change the message, but the pastor did say things all along the way that validated and demonstrated an appreciation and understanding of the Islamic tradition, because that whole community is interfaith. And the people in the community were paying attention just naturally to the fact we were in the month of Ramadan. And the people of the community were checking on those members to make sure they weren't asking them about Ramadan. They knew Ramadan.
Yeah.
They knew what the requirements were, and they wanted to make sure that everything was in place. And they did it in such a way that didn't make it a big deal. It was like, well, of course, this is what and here, Christians are trying not to pray in Jesus' name. Muslims are trying never to say the Prophet Muhammad, blessed be he. So I dream a world where we can all be the faith we are, and everybody understands we're not trying to convince everybody to be our faith in prayer. One of Rabbi Strauss' new staff people, Jay Gardner, he did his dissertation on can we pray together? And I love that, because he wasn't saying you got to pray the way I pray, but can we pray together and not feel bad or like we hurt somebody or offended somebody, but can we pray together? And then I can respect the faith tradition out of which you pray. And we have a lot of work to do on that one.
I agree. And, I think part of what you said without saying it is, how do you do this work? You need to show up.
Yes.
You need to show up. You can't just come for the occasional service or rally. If you're going to do this work seriously, you need to be there.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be in a relationship, and you can't develop relationships if it's only occasional.
Yeah.
At this time, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity for other folks on the call to pose questions to our panelists. So if you'd like, you can raise your hand, you can drop a question in the chat, whatever is easiest for you. Go ahead, John.
Hi, thank you both very much for your comments, and I think the point was well made at the very beginning, of that our faith should also impel us out into the public square to try and do good. My question was then, how does then our religion and beliefs guide us when we're doing that? Because of course you don't need faith to say care about gun violence, drug problems, and all that. So what makes it different than when someone who's religious or has faith is then trying to do that?
I think a quick answer to at least one phase of that is I think people of faith don't give up. Like we are spurred on by faith. When we think it's impossible, people of faith are possibility thinkers. It's like everything can point to, oh, this will not work. But it's our faith that says, yeah, but we believe that there's another force at work here, spurring us on. And it might not work today, but it'll work tomorrow. So I'm going to do what I'm called to do. So I think that's one way. It just keeps us willing to be at the table, willing to go forward, willing to take the risk, because we don't do it, but we're aware that what we're doing is not simply our selfish desire.
The other part, John, that I would add to it, what I heard you ask is, in a sense, there are lots of people who are not people of faith who are working on the issues that Donna and I both spoke about are important for us to work about, that our faith impels us to do. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not just people of faith who are working for social justice and to better and improve our world and to create the kind of world that we all want for our children and grandchildren, or that we believe our faith is called to us to help create. But I think, I can only speak as a Jew. I think there is value in being with people who are like me, in that we share a common language, we share common values, we share a common tradition. So, I could do the work I'm doing with RAC-PA on voter engagement just as easily with the League of Women Voters, and they do wonderful work. And the truth is, in RAC-PA, we partner with the League of Women Voters to do some of our work. But the fact that we're able to do it with other Reformed Jews who, share, again, as I said, a common narrative in Jewish tradition, who are guided by, halakha, Jewish law that requires us to be able to act in that and can articulate that, I think is very important. So I actually think one of the things that I'm pushing the group that I'm involved with, within the Jewish community, very important. I think when we do the social justice work that we're doing, it has to be deeply rooted in Jewish values, and we shouldn't be afraid to be able to use that language and share it with others, as well as making sure that we're fluent in that language. So, I'm chairing right now a committee on gun violence for the JCRC, and we begin each of our sessions by taking 15 or 20 minutes to look at Jewish sources and traditions and teachings about what we're called to do and develop a common vocabulary in that way. I don't think we have to be embarrassed, or, we shouldn't cede religious language only to the right. We have a deep, rich religious language that we shouldn't be afraid to use. We're not, forcing it on other people, but we should feel comfortable using that language when we're amongst ourselves, and frankly, in the public sphere as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, you both for your sharing. Yeah, just one thing I want to clarify a little bit what Dr. Donald said about the how can you, like, if I understand correctly, you said like you should not talk about like morality in a public square, or like separate morality from public square. That
Yeah, I do believe there's I think that anything that we're doing that is good and comes from a center of love belongs in a public square. So if we look at morality from the standpoint of harm, an immoral act is an act where I've harmed someone else. So to me anyway, if we look at it from the standpoint of do no harm, I think that is what we talk about all the time. If we look at it from the standpoint of my opinion about whether or not people can love who they love, that when people take my scripture to justify their opinion, now I've got a problem. So I think the ethic of love sits with me more so than the traditional way of looking at morality. Did somebody steal $5 from the from the offering plate? Yeah, that is an immoral act. But if we only focus on the $5, that person might be hungry and might be starving and might be going to die tomorrow. And all the wealth in the church isn't helping that person. Is it immoral to do? I don't know. So using the plumb line of love as opposed to the plumb line of, I think we have a constructed morality in the church. We've constructed a morality that takes us away from love, not necessarily a biblical morality. I know that's, I want to spend more time on that answer, but.
Go ahead, Molly.
Okay, so I have kind of a I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate it all that well. My goal is to be a deaconess within the Lutheran community, and that is more of a call to social action and to social justice after ordination. So my question is, I know many churches and many different organizations right now are having a serious problem getting people to come together and getting organizations where we should have the basic, we all believe this, and then we should be able to go from that very basic understanding that we're all a church family or we're all members of this one group. But we can't seem to come together. And I think COVID made it worse. And so do you have any advice for those of us who are attempting to work with the very where we should be a church family, we should be this organization, we should have a basic, God is love, or we should be able to have this, and we don't. And everybody wants to nitpick, and everyone wanted their individual belief recognized. And I know that's not really a question, but if you have any advice for how to work together, I am all ears. I mean, I 100% believe we should be in the public square. But I don't know how to get others to agree with me.
How to work together. I think we should ask Edward Livingston that question. I think that's the eternal, for those of us of the Christian tradition, or the Christian and Jewish traditions, not like the followers of Jesus are that complicated. Within the Abrahamic traditions, I look at those men and women who were part of that group, and Lord knows they didn't get along. I think if we look at religious movements going way back, people didn't get along. I think part of the miracle of the fact we accomplish anything is a testament to God, because the human element, and when you take the human element, you add to it religion and certainty. I'm sure we're supposed to do it this way because God told me. It's messy. I think Rabbi Strauss, with another question, talked about how hard it is. That is hard. And I think we want to blame sometimes, we had COVID, we could only meet online, this, that, and the third. But some people did the extra work of making sure those connections were sustained and even strengthened online. We use what was available to us to be connected and to continue. But that issue of people working together, it's messy.
Yeah, I would add to that in no particular order. First off, I think it's important to find colleagues, either within your denomination or outside of your denomination, who can support you and challenge you in the work that you're doing. I think you need to ask the question, how deeply rooted is what I think I'm fighting for in my tradition? And where do I find those roots and teach them and nurture them and bring them forth to people? One of the things I learned from one of my teachers in seminary, Rabbi Jack Stern, he talked about preferences and principles and said, you should never compromise your principles. But it's also really important to make sure you know the difference between your preferences and your principles and not make a preference into a principle. There's a difference there. And the last thing, there was an article that was actually written in I think it's now called the Journal of Reform Judaism. It was called the Fox News Chavurah. This was written by a colleague who's serving in a pretty red community. And she put forth a question that I think is a very helpful question, which is to ask somebody, what is it that you see that I don't see that leads you to need to act or support what it is that you're doing? What do you see that I don't see? That's a very non-judgmental way, instead of saying, what kind of an idiot are you? How could you possibly believe what you believe? That's probably not going to help as a conversation. I think the last thing I would say is, Again, I'm not sure we are prophetic leaders, but if we are going to be leaders for justice, or at least soldiers for justice, we have to be willing to take hits, and it's going to hurt. You're going to lose friends, and you got to decide that it's okay to do that. You're maybe going to lose congregants. You may even lose a job, and you need to decide, is that okay? And I get, it's easy for me to say that now, being the rabbi emeritus. I tell Edward, it's actually the rabbi irrelevant. I can say whatever I want because nobody listens and takes it seriously anymore. I know it's not easy in the world we're living in to say, well, I can afford to have some people leave. I get that, depending on the size of your congregation, that may actually not be true. And I, so I think that's a very individual, you have to pray on that for yourself.
Yeah,
How courageous are you willing to be?
that,
But
no, go ahead.
thank you. I just, both Reverend Donna and Rabbi David, thank you both for just all of this, particularly the response just now to Molly's question. One thing I'd like to add, and I have a question. Combining what you just heard, I would echo all of it, and I also would add, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Start somewhere and build, and be willing to start small and work on those principles or values. And then to also echo with that, if a community of people understand that you love them, that biblical love, that if they understand that you care, you will have more opportunities with them. And you'll be able to do the very important thing of surfacing what matters to them. And when you can find some points of intersection of what matters to them and what matters to you, and usually there's some crisis, some injustice that's happening that this interacts with, then you have an avenue to walk together and explore together. And it, in my experience, maybe I am not the greatest organizer on the planet, never said I was. It takes an awful lot of time to be able to invest time and track where you're going and be able to celebrate small victories with people, steps forward, as well as being able to lament when something didn't go the way you hoped, but don't give up.
Yeah. I wanted to add one area that usually doesn't get discussed in this is the place of church and religious buildings in the public square. Coming from a place as an African American where so much subversive work happens in church basements, and I think Rabbi Strauss could speak to that as well. For oppressed peoples, we got to have some buildings left standing. We're too quick to say, I don't need a building, or the church doesn't need a building. That's a common, the synagogue doesn't need a building, the masjid doesn't need a building. There's got to be some buildings, because there's got to be those places where the government can't tell us what to do. Our buildings have been sanctuary in cities that did not sign on to the sanctuary city movement. Our churches have been places where movements for justice have happened in secret. Our churches were places, in our synagogues and our masjids were places that harbored runaway slaves. We cannot throw out every single building. So for those of you, especially that are in seminary, that I think is going to be continue to be a push to divest, because people don't realize how much wealth the church really has, or how much wealth the synagogue really has, or how much wealth the masjid really has. And there's not a willingness to share. And it's not saying there's got to be a religious building every 3 feet, but we have to have some conversation if we're talking about this, about subversive justice and where justice is nurtured.
Molly, I would add, two other things that I just thought about a little bit, to your question. At least in Jewish tradition, we have this value called midat hadin, strict justice. And none of us can live up to God's strict justice, which is why we need rachamim, which is called mercy. And I think that's true of leading a movement as well. We have high aspirations, but we're working with human beings, and we need to have both that prophetic vision in front of us, but also the sense of mercy and tenderness. Maybe that's what Donna is calling love in the work that we're doing as well. And both are needed. We are, first of all, two other things I would share very briefly. As much as we are called to prophetic religion, remember that every one of our prophets had extreme doubt and moments of anxiety and who me? And how am I ever going to do this? And ran away. And that's part of this journey as well. And the last that would share with you, in the Jewish community, we're right now in the very middle of the book of Leviticus, where Leviticus at its most thick. It's the bar mitzvah portion or bat mitzvah portion that every kid gets and turns to their mother and father and says, "Are you kidding me? Purification after childbirth, leprosy, I'm supposed to, for real?" And in the midst of that, and it's a portion that deals with, calling out what is pure and what is profane. Those are the categories that are used. And the priest is the diagnostician of all of this. In the midst of that, when he's called, it's in chapter 13, verse 44 and 45, I believe, he's called to look at a house that has this apparent eruption. And the priest is supposed to say, something like a affliction has come upon this place. And it's striking in chapter after chapter where everything is black and white. Suddenly the priest has to say something like. And I think the point behind that is, as much as that prophetic call is in front of us, and we are certain about what is right and wrong and just and unjust and what we need to do to be able to reformulate the world, a little bit of religious humility is required as well.
When you both shared that, it spurred a question that not everyone has early environments of fostering them for religion in the public square. They come to it later in life, or second career even, right? So what role did theological education, those institutions, play in either strengthening or distracting from exploring and fostering religion in the public square?
Well, I'll give a shout out to Lutheran. We had a course on religion in the public square. We had a course on Black theology. When I went, Black theology, womanist theology, Latin theology. I mean, there was a big prophetic preaching. It definitely strengthened the things that I grew up with, and gave, I guess, gave me a mental confidence when I got out in the world and heard other things. And it was like, oh no, apparently you haven't read Cone. You know how we are when we get some education. So it amplified and gave me references to put on papers.
I don't think that my seminary education was tremendously focused on this. I think perhaps the place that it came up was, really when I was going through seminary, was really the struggle for the freedom for Soviet Jewry and South Africa in terms of apartheid and witnessing that. And I guess where it was expressed was when we had to give a sermon in the chapel, which nobody went to. But I want to give you, I actually think newly ordained clergy, actually being the assistant or the associate, gives you a lot more freedom if you have the right senior than the senior has, because you can articulate and say things that he or she maybe doesn't have the freedom to be able to articulate or say, because they can always say, oh, come on, it's just the assistant, they're young, You know, they need to learn. I need to give them their legs to be able to begin to run. But it also gives you a lot more freedom, I think, at least in the Jewish community, in a paradoxical kind of way, if you have the right senior who will give you that freedom.
Thank you. I can echo what was shared, particularly what Reverend Donna shared. I'm also an alum of Lutheran Theological, and that was the location and the community that allowed me to explore and expose me to what ultimately became my track of faith-based community organizing. So I might not have gone that direction had I been in that particular institution during those particular years.
Do we have other questions for our panelists? Yes, Jen.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations and all your insights. I'm not sure if I can clearly explain this, but in different issues that go on in society, there are faith-based groups on both sides. Like you've got the right, the left. So you've got very strong groups, both believing they're on God's side. And they've got the moral right. And I have tried to look at ways as how do you reach past the positions that people have and get to the person, and is there a way when you've got such maybe strong stereotypes of each other and strong positions and beliefs that God's telling you to do this, either one side or the other, is there a way of bridging this? Have you found any way of doing that?
No, I'm not sure it can be bridged. You know, I can have a curiosity about it, maybe asking that question again that I suggested of what do you see that I don't see that leads you to go where you're going. But I think on certain issues, they really are matters of principle, and I can't compromise my principles. And no, I think there may be, that doesn't mean there aren't issues that we can work on together, but there are going to be issues. So, you know, but we have people from St. Charles in the Catholic Church, and we're at the end of our time, so I'll go out on a limb here. You know, in my role with the National Council of Synagogues, we are the Jewish dialogue partner for the liberal Jewish community with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. There are lots of issues that we can work on together that we, you know, we're lockstep. You know, the church's position on the poor, on refugees, on the environment, are issues that we're going to be in complete lockstep with, and can absolutely find alliances and make a difference, I hope, together. But they're also, at least in the Jewish community, on issues of sexuality, we're not going to agree. And I don't think we need to spend our time trying to convince each other that we're right and you're wrong. I think we can learn from each other, but it's clear we're going to have different positions. And you know, I don't have to agree with everything somebody says or believes or stands for in order to be able to work with them on other issues. You know, that's what makes creating that table so very difficult. It's never easy. We're complicated as human beings. Let's be honest about it. We human beings are very complicated people.
Yeah, I think on that I had, she recently passed away over the summer. One of those cousins that's like a sister, because we're the cousins that lived. She's in DC, she's right outside of DC. I'm in Philly. The rest of the family is farther away. So my middle name is for her mother. You know, that's how close Aunt Mary was to my mom. So as cousins, we grew up together, we traveled together. We were just really sister cousins. And Deborah ended up being a show enough evangelical, right-wing conservative. And we always would go to Deborah's house for Thanksgiving. And so you can imagine Thanksgiving got to be interesting because we would stay, we'd stay at the house. And not only was it Deborah, it was Deborah's husband, Deborah's kids. It was like, oh my God, rescue us. But because it's what we did, we weren't going to not talk to each other. We weren't going to not have Thanksgiving. And we had some very difficult conversations around issues that were so, core to our belief systems, where we were on opposite ends. But what I found, so Deborah was a staunch, serious pro-life advocate. And I am a woman's right to choose. And I remember the conversation to this day that kind of began with us in unison. How could you? But over the years, and I'm talking years, what ended up happening is Deborah came to understand how, and I came to understand how. Neither one of us changed opinions, but respect grew. And it was like, okay, I really do understand why you feel this way. I just hope you missed the last election. And then we would laugh. So when she passed away, her husband did her eulogy. And Robbie was speaking about different people in their lives and the influence they had. And Robbie is also very much totally far right. And he said, he learned in watching the relationship between me and Deborah, how to have a softer heart. And he learned that that's the center of everything, that you really care, that you're coming from a place of love, coming from a place of caring. And he said, I still don't agree, but at least I understand that these are good people. I understand why they believe what they believe. And so I think it's possible, but it centers in relationships over time. I wouldn't have had the energy for that for 10 people, but I did have, and apparently so did Deborah, for the one person that I loved.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your time this evening and for taking those questions. As we get ready to wrap up, I have one final one, and it stems, Reverend Donna, from what you were just speaking about. And, the work that is involved in occasionally coming from those places of difference to try to find commonality. I suppose at this point, looking at, a highly divisive, stratified society, what's at stake for us in this moment as we work to find and uncover the common good and to work towards that?
I think Rabbi Strauss and I are both hoping the other person speaks first.
What's at stake for me is what kind of America do I want to live in, and what kind of America do I want to leave? Forget my children. My children are now grown. What kind of America do I want to leave someday, if they have them, for my grandchildren? What kind of society do I want to live in, and how are the values that I understand my tradition calls me to be faithful to, and not only to live by, but to actualize in the world in which I live? I mean, there's, an interesting question, perhaps. What do you need to be able to have a synagogue? Donna was talking about the importance of buildings. So if you go into most synagogues, the three things that people will answer you have to have is an ark and eternal light, and nobody ever gets the third. So actually, you don't really need the ark. The ark is if you need a Torah, and you don't necessarily read from scripture at every service. And it could be portable. It doesn't have to be a physical part of the space that you're worshiping in. The eternal light is there because that's supposed to represent, I think, God's eternal presence in the world in that kind of way. And if it's supposed to be symbolic, maybe it's our passion and compassion in the same way that light brings forth. But the third thing that nobody gets right is a window. And the question is, why do you need a window in a synagogue or in a sanctuary? And, you know, one answer may be, hey, look, obviously in pre-modern times, when you didn't have an electric switch to put on, you needed a window because otherwise it was dark and you couldn't read the book or the scripture or the manuscript in front of you. But I think there's a more profound answer about why you need a window, which is that if religion is going to be all about your needs and your wants, and I guess the term we would use, your personal salvation or your group's salvation, and doesn't somehow propel you out into the world in which we live, to see both the beauty of the world in which we live and the beauty of God's creation and the diversity of God's creation, as well as how terribly broken our world is and is in need of our being God's partner in repairing the world. If it doesn't propel you out into the world, then that's not prayer. That's just about self-centeredness. And as I began, it's really, I think, the ultimate form of narcissism. You know, the quote of Abraham Joshua Heschel, you've all perhaps seen the picture of Dr. Heschel with Dr. King marching in Selma. And he's holding a Torah scroll. And, you know, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or true, but asked, you know, what was that experience like? And he said, that day my feet were praying. Which is a way, I think, of saying, you know, religion, it can't be, there certainly are moments when we want to go on that mountaintop or that time of silence or of meditation or escape from the world. I know all of our faith traditions have part of that, but it's certainly in my faith tradition, not the normative part. The normative part of my faith tradition says, you know, you need to be God's partner in helping to mend the world. And, you know, I hope if I taught my confirmation and my students anything, it was, you know, take your hands and look at them and remember God has no hands with yours.
Yeah, I think for me, I know I was influenced by a quote that has this odd quote that's just stuck with me. The world is my parish. That if everyone could kind of center in on that, with clergy or religious, you know, the world is my parish. Parish is a place where you care for one another, you speak honestly and authentically, you hold each other accountable. You know, how wonderful it would be if the world was every parish. You know, we were all looking out for each other, all loving each other, all holding each other accountable, all willing to stay at the table like me and Deborah. If we all had that kind of sense of responsibility and an opportunity, there's an opportunity in that life as well.
Dr. Jones, Rabbi Strauss, thank you again so much for your time this evening. And thank you for sharing of yourselves, of your own experiences, and, you know, sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with this group. For those of you who are, you know, currently in seminary, there will be upcoming sessions targeted specifically towards going through our Inter-Seminary initiative. And then there are a number of other offerings that Interfaith Philadelphia offers. And you can learn more about those at interfaithphiladelphia.org. You should be able to click to it through one of the emails that you sent with your information, that we sent with the information for this evening. So thank you all again so much for your time. And please, if you have any questions, my name is Regina. I am wrapping up my time with Interfaith Philadelphia in the next few weeks, but please feel free to be in touch and I can help direct your questions to whoever the most appropriate person is. So thank you again.
Thank you all for joining us. And this was wonderful. Thank you for having me. I hope we were able to share something of value.
Yeah, that's great. And to Regina's point, I put in the chat for you all the next offering that's coming up from Interfaith Philadelphia. So if you wanted to save that or just click on the link, it'll take you to the page. That way you'll have it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful
Very
evening.
much.
Good.